pump coming down, and with that we expect that to reduce the pressure on inflation. Looking more deeply into the data released by Stats NZ today, there are some encouraging signs. What Stats report is that without the Trump spike in fuel prices, inflation would have been back in the target band at 2.9%. What they also record is that we've now had the lowest non-tradable inflation in the New Zealand economy in 5 years. That is an encouraging sign that the underlying factors driving inflation are being better controlled by our government. We've also seen much lower food price inflation than has been the case in recent times, dropping back, and certainly much lower than the double-digit figures of food price inflation we saw under the previous government. In fact, some food items, including fruit, have actually dropped in price. And most encouragingly, I'd highlight for you that we have seen the lowest rent increases in 25 years at 0.5%. That is very meaningful for many New Zealanders who are renting, including those who are saving to purchase their first home, which we are seeing in larger numbers than has previously been the case. So overall, of course, we acknowledge that this is a higher inflation figure than anyone would want to see. We acknowledge the pain that many New Zealanders have experienced with high petrol and diesel prices. But as I say, it has been encouraging to see those prices coming down in more recent weeks. Well, Donald Trump has certainly made things harder. And I think any economist would fully acknowledge that the cause of this high inflation in the quarter just released is the international oil shock. That is what has caused this inflation. What the data shows is that in the absence of that petrol and diesel spike, inflation would be in target right now. We cannot control international events. What we can control is our response to them. National's disciplined approach of fiscal prudence has meant that inflation hasn't spiked even higher. If you look across the OECD, other countries on average in the OECD have had inflation spike to 4.6%. We are at lower levels than that. We have actively chosen not to pour fuel on the inflation fire with wasteful spending of our own. The last government took a different approach when international inflation factors were putting pressure on. They got out the spending bazooka and they hit it hard, and the result was that inflation went much higher and it stayed much higher for longer. We're taking a careful, disciplined approach so that we don't have out-of-control inflation for longer than should need to be the case. I think any New Zealander who's purchased petrol in the past few months knows what has happened. It has gone up massively in price, and that has contributed to pressure on everyone's household budget, and they need only look at international oil prices and the events in the Middle East to know the cause of that. I think New Zealanders understand that high petrol price has contributed to the cost of living in New Zealand, and it is the case that our government could have made things worse with our own decisions. We have acted very carefully and prudently so that we have not done that. And as I say, what this data does show is that underlying, without that petrol and diesel spike, inflation would be back in target. We are experiencing the lowest rent increases in 25 years. Food price inflation is within the target band, much lower than it was under Labor, with some food items coming down in price. Now, none of that means that anything is easy for New Zealanders. I fully acknowledge that many New Zealanders are continuing to experience pressure on their household budgets. The government's job is to do everything we can to strengthen the underlying fundamentals of the economy so that people's wages increase faster than prices and so that there are more job opportunities in this economy. And that's what our plans are doing. Just yesterday we announced more developments with our resource management reforms. One of those is going to be to permit the growing of vegetables in New Zealand. Well, Labor opposed that. Well, what would that do to food price inflation? That would spike it up further. We are taking careful, deliberate decisions that strengthen the economy.
What about electricity and rates prices, though? Can you complain that Donald Trump...
Look, rates increases have been of real concern to our government. That's why we are progressing reforms to both reduce the layers of local government and reduce the costs imposed by the resource management system. It's also why we are legislating for rate caps, because we do not accept that the level of rate increases that New Zealanders have had to put up with in recent years is acceptable, and we are acting to prevent that happening in future. I note that Labor, who like to cry about the increase in rates, also oppose rates capping. which is to say that they would have rates continuing to increase at these rates into the future. On electricity, we acknowledge that it has been a very difficult period in terms of electricity prices, as our government has had to play catch-up for the terrible decisions that the last government made in the electricity market. We are now making progress. In the past 3 years, we have consented more than double the amount of renewable electricity generation than the last government achieved in its 8 years. Let me say that again. We have consented so much renewable energy that it's more than double what the previous government achieved during its 6 years in office. That's important because when you actually have more electricity being generated, that's what will put downward pressure on prices in the future. It's also worth acknowledging that the data for the quarter just released in part reflects the decision on 1 April that saw the lines rates for electricity go up. That was a decision that related to the regulatory framework under the last government and in part reflected the high inflation and interest rates that occurred under that government. So we acknowledge electricity prices have been a pain point. We are doing everything in our power to bring them down in future. Well, as I've said to you, the key thing is to ensure that we are getting more electricity generation into the system so that we don't get the shortages that lead to price spikes. We are achieving that. We have seen more new electricity generation projects consented in the past 3 years than the previous government achieved during its past 6 years. In fact, we've consented double what they did. So that electricity generation coming into the market will put downward pressure on prices in the future.
Meridian has said that they've seen wholesale prices drop about 35% for next year, 15% in the 2 years following that on the ASX market. And they're saying that they are seeing commercial customers negotiate cheaper electricity prices. Is it time for them to cut their residential electricity prices?
You are right that we are seeing wholesale electricity prices are now coming down with the reforms advanced by our government, and we do expect to see that being passed through to consumers. Meridian have been out of the block saying that they're intending to reduce electricity rates for some of their commercial customers. That is positive to see, and as we see more generation coming on and wholesale prices coming down, then yes, we do expect to see that being passed on to New Zealand customers.
Should they be cutting prices now, though? I mean, we're seeing what will probably be record profits from them.
Well, this is why we've beefed up the Electricity Authority as the regulator, because we do want them watching the gentailers very closely to ensure that they are pricing electricity fairly. What I've acknowledged, and which it's disappointing to see and my opponents in Parliament don't acknowledge, is that the key factor that drives electricity prices is how much generation of electricity is occurring in our economy. We have got at the root of that problem by fast-tracking consents for new solar farms, new wind farms, and those reforms have been successful. We are consenting more renewable electricity now than has been the case for many, many years. That will put downward pressure on electricity prices. I have not heard from our opponents any proposals that would achieve that.
A high-level question. Do you think there's enough depth and breadth in the New Zealand economy for it to do well while the housing market remains subdued?
Yes, I do. I feel very positive about the long-term prospects for the New Zealand economy. We produce goods and services that the world wants. We produce food and fibre products efficiently, and we are getting good prices for those, and there's enormous capacity for us to add value to those products. With things like the free trade agreement with India, we will see things like kiwi fruit and apples achieving higher prices with more consumers across the world. We also have a diversified economy. People point to the primary industry and say, are we too dependent there? Well, actually, we have Rocket Lab that is sending very advanced rockets into space. We have software companies. We have a film industry. We have a really vibrant tourism industry that is recovering with the guidance of our government. So when I look at New Zealand, I see a place that is safe, that is going to increasingly be a place that global investors will want to put their money. We are going to have some of the most renewable energy in the world, so it's going to be a good place to centre manufacturing and centre those sorts of projects. And I see that we have smart entrepreneurial people. Our government's on their side. We want to encourage them to invest, to build their capital. That's why we've done Investment Boost. There are parties in Parliament who would seek to destroy that entrepreneurial spirit by imposing new taxes, by removing Investment Boost, by getting in the way of entrepreneurialism.
You said earlier about petrol prices coming down. Do you expect that to last? And has Cabinet had any discussions, because no one's been on the $3 for I think the last couple of weeks? Have you had any
So no, but the first thing to note on the monitoring of the petrol price is that we use slightly different data from the gas spy data that you see publicly. MB do a monitoring process which weights prices regionally to create a national average, and we've had 2 weeks of data now that shows that just under $3. However, of course, we're still monitoring that very closely. As you observe, with things heating up in the Middle East again, we have seen international oil prices come up from their lows. They came down to about $70. They're now up over $80. And unfortunately, I do expect to see that reflected at the pump in New Zealand. I'd note that it's not quite as acute as the pressure that we experienced back in April, where prices spiked to over $100 a barrel. We're not seeing that or expecting that, but it's certainly unwelcome to see the international oil price going up. And once again, we want to see a ceasefire. We want to see the conflict in the Middle East come to an end. We want to see oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. That's what New Zealand consumers need if we're going to have sustained low petrol prices.
So you haven't had those conversations yet?
No, we haven't, because the trigger for those conversations will be if we've had 4 weeks of the nationally weighted average petrol price being below $3. We haven't had that yet, and we're very conscious that it's been hovering just below $3, and that in recent days we've actually seen that price coming back up again. So we could see that reflected in the national data. So we're monitoring it very closely. Look, I want to see petrol prices lower for New Zealanders. I do not control Donald Trump. I do not control the Ayatollahs. If I could, I would do everything I could to bring peace to our land so that you had cheaper prices at the pump. But unfortunately, some things are outside my control.
Last question.
Excessive government spending that's at prices and leaves fewer resources for the firms, farms and families that create prosperity. Your government is obviously continuing, debt is still continuing to rise before being having to surface in a few years' time. Are you still spending too much money?
No, we're not. In Treasury's view, we are not adding pressure to inflation because we have been so careful about our discretionary spending choices. This is in stark contrast to the previous government, who, when inflation was going higher, were in a very expansionary fiscal position, adding billions and billions of additional spending to the economy. We're not taking that approach. We have been very careful because we know that the first rule is first do no harm. And a government can do real harm by getting out the spending bazooka and putting fuel on the inflation fire. We've actively chosen not to do that, and Treasury's advice is that our fiscal stance has supported inflation to be lower than it would otherwise be.
What happens if you have the consecutive 4 weeks become below $3? You take the subsidy away, but then you creep back up again because there's a resumption of...
Well, there's no automatic taking away of the in-work tax credit. If we have 4 weeks of data which shows the national average below $4, that would trigger Cabinet consideration of removing the in-work tax credit. Obviously, when we do that consideration, we will take into account all of the factors at the time, i.e., are we expecting that the prices will be spiking up again? Do we expect that they will remain low? What do we expect to see? That trigger is intended to support our position that the in-work tax credit increase was intended to be a temporary and targeted initiative, targeted for the period in which petrol prices remained high. So if petrol prices are remaining high, then it would be appropriate that additional support remain there for vulnerable families. If petrol prices are being sustained at lower prices, then we would remove that additional support. We chose a temporary and targeted approach because we acknowledge that for some families the pressures have been particularly acute, those on low incomes with few choices about how they get to work, and with children to support are who we targeted support at. But again, it was always meant to be temporary, and if we see petrol prices coming down, that will trigger consideration by Cabinet.
That's us, guys.
Pretty unlikely to do that before the election, wouldn't you?
Well, we need to consider all of the factors at the time, but we always said that this was intended to be there as a temporary measure, and that if prices were being sustained below $3, then that would be a trigger for lifting it. The challenge at the moment is just that we're in a volatile environment. We saw prices come well down, and now we're seeing them creep back up again. So we need to be mindful of that and take into account all of the latest data and not do a hypothetical predicting what may happen in the future. If there's anything we've seen over the past few months is that it's difficult to predict the future when Donald Trump is the president.
The Minister will be back on House Run.